Hey everybody, what's going on? There's a lot to dive into for today's Montreal Canadiens video, including just before we hit record on this video, Jordan Harris of the Habs just signed a 2-year contract extension with an average annual value of $1.4 million per season. It's hard to find any real flaws with that number. We've continued to see some really solid growth from Harris on the back end. He looks like he's going to be a solid number 4 or number 5 defenseman in the NHL for a very long time. He's got really good poise. He can move the puck. He defends fairly well as well. He's just a really solid two-way presence for this Montreal Canadiens team on their blue line. And it's nice to see that he's continued to find that positive trajectory with his growth as a young NHL defenseman in this league. He hasn't really missed a beat, and you're noticing he's kind of continued to progress at a higher level than maybe some people thought he was capable of. So I think it's only really been positive news surrounding Harris. So it's good to see him locked up for another 2 seasons on the Habs blue line. The Montreal Canadiens will take to the ice for their annual doubleheader on Super Bowl weekend in the afternoon. Some matinees to be going on this weekend for the Habs. And I think there's a lot to talk about heading into the second half of the regular season for the Canadiens. There's a lot of things that we have to keep an eye on for this squad. The trade deadline's less than a month away now. There's been some slight updates surrounding Sean Monahan and Joel Edmondson, two players that could be moved from the Montreal Canadiens ahead of that deadline, assuming they are healthy. They both started skating again after the All-Star break after being shut down during. So I think that's positive news in terms of hopefully having those assets available to be moved. But worst case for Edmondson, he still has another year on his contract. So the Montreal Canadiens can potentially move him in the summer or at next year's trade deadline, depending on his health. I think that's kind of been something that's been up in the air with him. He's had some back issues. He's had some lower body injuries. So I think there's a lot up in the air in regards to Edmondson. But there's no doubt that when he's on the ice and playing, other GMs and front offices around the league see value in him. And I think that he can fetch some really nice pieces for the Montreal Canadiens in return whenever they do decide to move him. Monahan's a little more iffy in that case because he is a free agent after this season. There's always the chance that the Canadiens could re-sign him to another 1-year, very minimal deal, and they could have some incentives built into that contract to make him earn a little bit more money depending on games played and such. But that doesn't seem as necessarily likely depending on what they decide to do with his health moving forward. If he's healthy ahead of the trade deadline and they can get a return that seems fair value, whether that's a second round pick, a solid prospect, or what have you, the Montreal Canadiens would be wise to move on from this player because there's just really no certainty surrounding him. There's a lot of injuries in the history of Sean Monahan's career, and it's really hard to rely on him as a player. So if the Montreal Canadiens can get a solid asset for him now, I think they'd be wise to do that, assuming he's on the ice ahead of the trade deadline. The one thing for me, at least, is going to be a focus in the second half of this season is regarding the Montreal Canadiens and their injury history. There has to be some questions asked about the management staff in terms of what's been going on in terms of diagnosis, in terms of the healing process, in terms of recovery, in terms of a lot of different things behind the scenes that we don't really have access to. There's just been a lot of injuries surrounding the Montreal Canadiens over the last half decade, and something has to give with this staff, and we're not going to put the full onus on them in terms of what's going on with these players on the ice. You can't really predict some of these injuries and even the recovery time for them. But just looking at what we've seen and what we're privy to, it's hard to believe that there couldn't be at least some improvements in this department for the Montreal Canadiens. So I think that's going to be something that's going to be heavily focused on down the stretch because you want players to be available. You want your young players to be able to develop. Of course, there's freak situations and injuries that you can't control, but there just needs to be more consistency in terms of how they deal with these injuries, what they give the public in terms of the information they give to us. I don't really believe they've been doing a good job of that as of right now. Look at the cases of Sean Monahan and Joel Edmondson. They haven't really been giving us much in terms of their overall healing and when they're going to return. So even if they don't necessarily know, like, tell us that, give us an idea of what's going on behind the scenes so that we can really prepare for this type of news. I don't really think they've been doing a perfect job of that, and I think there's changes needed in that department. So that's something I'm going to be following very closely here moving forward. That's it for me today from Cook's Corner. As always, let me know in the comment section down below what your focus is going to be in the second half of the season for this Montreal Canadiens team. I'm Zach Cook. We'll see you later.